Shavua Tov. We're actually at the bottom of Daf Ayin Tes Amud Aleph, and we did the Mishnah, and we began the sugya of Rav Chizda. Let's just review and summarize some of what we know from the Mishnah. First of all, we said that what's unique about Pesach, as opposed to other Karbanos Tzibur, all of which are brought B'tumah, is that with regard to the Karban Pesach, not only do we bring the Karban B'tumah, but we even eat the Karban B'tumah. And the Mishnah here on Daf Ayin Tes Amud Aleph addresses the question of Pesach Sheni. The Torah says that if a person is Tameh on the 14th of Nisan, then he should bring the Pesach on the 14th of Iyar, a full month later. And if, for example, the tzibur as a rov is tameh, rov hatzibur tmeim, then the halacha is that the Pesach is brought b'tumah, even eaten b'tumah, as opposed to the individual. If he contracts tumah, then he is delayed to Pesach Sheni. The Mishnah then goes on and has another case, a category in which the Kohanim contracted tumah, so that the avodas hakarban requires tmeim. And even though the kol itself are tahorim, the Mishnah says that if the Kohanim, and presumably it means all the Kohanim, are tmeim, so we don't have any Kohanim who can do the avoda of the Karban Pesach, Pitara, then once again, we override the normal halacha of Tumah, and we bring the Karban B'tumah. And the question then becomes, what about Kohanim who are on service? They contracted Tumah, but maybe they're far away Kohanim that can be recruited to do who are Tahorim, and can be recruited to bring the Karban Pesach. And then we had a discussion about the Kalim. What if the Kli Shares contracted Tumah? And we said that also might be reason to override Tumah and bring the Karban B'tumah. In the case where only the miut of the kol are tmeim, that's called nitma miut kol in the language of the Mishnah, then the Tahorim will bring the Karban Pesach B'tara, and the miut tmeim are delayed or pushed off till Pesach Sheni. That's a summary of the Mishnah. The Gemara then quotes a Brisa, and the Brisa mentions explicitly the case of Kli Shares, that if the Kol are tmeim, but the Kohanim and the Kli Shares are Tahorim, then we will bring the Karban B'tumah. Alternatively, if the Tzibur, the Kol are Tahorim, but either the Kohanim or the Kli Shares are tmeim, then we will bring the Karban B'tumah. And the reason for that is because Ein Karban Tzibur Chaluk. And we said what it meant was that once we're bringing the Karban B'tumah, then even the Tahorim are going to be part of the Karban B'tumah. They don't have to avoid and try very carefully to dance around the tulips, and tiptoe and make sure that they don't contract tumah and they don't eat the Karban B'tumah. All that is gone, because once the Karban is brought B'tumah, then all the maisim are identical as if it had been a Karban B'tara. And we even mentioned that one of the Rishonim, the Tosfos Rid, says that if the let's say the Tahorim would say, you know what, we'll bring our Karban Pesach, let the Tmeim bring their Karban Pesach, that would be awesome. It's almost insulting, the Tmeim. Or now, here we get to Rav Chisda, and that was the main focus of our discussion last week. Rav Chisda makes a distinction between the following two cases. The sakin, the knife that's used for shechita, could have contracted tumah in one of two possible ways. One would be with contact with a mess or with a tummy mess, in which case the sakin itself, insofar as it's metal, which is called cherev hareu kecholol, gets upgraded to the same status, the same intensity of tumah as the mess itself or as the tummy mess, which means that now the sakin itself becomes an avatuma, and it conveys tumah to Adam the Kalin, so that the shochet, when he slaughters the karman and he's holding on to the sakin, which in turn had contracted tumah from a mess or a tummy mess, he now the shochet contracts tumah, and therefore we have what's called tumas hagavra. However, says Rav Chisda, although in such a case we will override the normal procedure that a carbon is not brought betuma, here we have to do so because the Torah is talking about bringing a carbon betuma if the gavra is tame, and in the language of Rav Chisda, that's called cherev harei kechol kamitami legavra. That the sakin, insofar as it came in contact with the tame mess and it was mateches, it was made of metal, then it's mitami the shochet the person, because an avatuma is mitami adam. And in such a case, bitumas haguf the kares chamis avid. What we're going to do is we're going to say that since the person who slaughtered the animal using this knife contracted a tumah chamura, and as a result, it would be an onesh kares if it wasn't for the fact that the carbon is brought betuma, it would be an isa kares for him to enter into the azara. So now we have a situation where, since the klei sharetz are tmeim, and therefore the carbon is being brought betuma, we are overriding the tumah chamura of an Iser Kares for a Tame Gavra to enter into the Azar. Once we've done so, then the floodgates are open, so to speak. Then there's no reason to be careful about Tumah. If the Torah allowed you to bring this carbon betuma in the case of Kli Sharetz, meaning even though the Gavra is Tame in such a way that if he enters into the Azar betuma, which he will do, he is going to contract an Iser Kares. And now we're being matir. Once we're being matir, that most severe Iser of an Iser Kares, then everything can be done betuma, and we have no hesitations. So Rav Chisda says, Kevan shenidcha Iser tuma chamur. With regard to this Pesach, we are overriding a very severe Iser tuma, namely an Iser Kares for a Tame Gavra to enter into the Azara. Then, you know what? As we said before, the floodgates are open. It doesn't matter anymore who will be makriv of this carbon and who will eat the carbon. Let the tahorim, let the tmeim, let the kohanim tmeim. No holds bar. Says Rav Chisda, but what happens in a case where the sakin came in contact now with the tummy mess, but only with the sheretz, and the sheretz is an avatuma, and it could be mitami adam as a rishon l'tuma. But gavra lo mitami le. In other words, although the sheretz itself is mitami and adam, why? Because the sheretz is an avatuma, which is mitami adam v'kelim. But in this case, the shochet had no contact with the sheretz. It was only the sakin that had contact with the sheretz. The sakin, therefore, becomes a rishon l'tumah. And a rishon l'tumah is not mitami adam v'kelim. So the shochet, therefore, is tahar. And what do we have over here? What is the Torah being matir? The Torah is being matir tumas basar. Now, if an adam tar eats kodshim tmeim, or for that matter, even if a tamei eats kodshim tmeim, he violates and eats a law. So the Torah in this case, allowing for tumas habasar, in the case where the sakin came in contact with the sheretz, was matir a lesser isur relative to the isur that we spoke about before when the sakin came in contact with the tamei mes. Why? Because the shochet now is tar. He remains tar. The carbon becomes tamei. And the halacha of a tar that eats a kodshim tmeim is only a lav. In this case, we're going to say the following, that let's cap it off at an isur lav. Let's override an isur lav, but not beyond that. The Torah is going to allow, for the sake of the carbon sibur of Pesach, to override the lower isur, the lesser isur, namely of eating basar tameh, which is only a law, but the Torah would not allow a more severe isur of tumas haguf. And in the language of Rav Chizda, nitma sakin b'tumas sheretz, the basar hu demitami la. So the basar now contracts tumah as a result of the sakin. And that's because the basar is called ochlin, and a rishon l'tumah is mitame ochlin umashkim, but l'gavra lo mitame la. A rishon l'tumah does not have the power to convey tumah to adam v'kelim, only to ochlin umashkim. Is in such a case, says Rav Chizda, tahorin avid, let the tahorim bring the carbon pesach, let them eat the carbon pesach, which is tameh, and that is a violation of an isur lav when the basar is tameh, but tmeim lo avid. We're not going to allow the tmeim to participate in this carbon, even though the basar is tameh, because once the tameh will participate in this carbon pesach, we're going to override an isur kares. It's not like a case of a tar who eats basar tameh, which is only an isur lav, but rather it's a case of a tameh who's eating kodshim. And if a tameh eats kodshim, that's an isur kares. V'al yechal habasar b'tumas haguf shehu b'kares. Because if we would allow the tameh, again, whatever tumah he contracted, we're not going into that. But if we're going to allow him to eat the carbon pesach, then we're talking about an isur kares. Ha'ochel min hakodshim kishu tameh ayev kares. And this is derived from a pasuk by Yikar Zayin, hanefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlom shel Hashem v'tumas olav v'nichras hanefesh hahi me'amel. And that applies even if the basar is tameh. He's still chayiv kares. That's a sugya in Masechet Zvachim. It's actually machlokes between the Chacham and Rav Yotzi, but we pass like the Chachamim, and that's the language here of Rav Chizda. The only problem we got stuck with last week, if you recall, was the word mutav. If you look carefully at the language of Rav Chizda, he says mutav she'achel bitumas basar belav. The language mutav is a little bit strange over here. That usually the word mutav is when you have two choices, then you choose the better of two choices. But here, Rav Chizda is not allowing you for two choices. He's not letting the Tmeim become part of this carbon Pesach because that would involve a violation of an Isur Kares. But in any event, the bottom line is that according to Rav Chizda, in that scenario where the Sakin contracted Tumah from Sheretz, then although we will override the Isur of Achilles Basar Tameh, which is a lav, but as far as Tmeim are concerned, they'll have to wait till Pesach Sheni. They cannot participate in this Pesach Rishon because that would entail a violation of a more serious Isur, namely an Isur Kares. So we're up to Alma. So let's see if we can find the place. We're on Daf Ayin Tesam and Aleph. And we're up from the bottom approximately, shall I say, 13 lines. I'm just guessing. The first word of the line is Basar, going up from the bottom. And if you move your pointer towards the left, you'll see Alma. And that's, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, where we stopped last week. Alma kasav Rav Chizda tuma dechuya hi b'tzibur v'chein Omer Rav Yitzchak tuma dechuya b'tzibur. So it means the following: that even though the Torah was matir, bringing a carbon b'tuma for the sake of the tzibur, the Torah didn't really want to be matir. B'koshi hitira Torah. It was with a dochak. It's not a full-fledged heter. If there's no possibility for the carbon to be brought b'tara, then we'll bring a b'tara. I'm sorry, we'll bring a b'tuma, I meant to say. But if we can find a possibility of bringing the carbon pesach b'tara, or bringing it b'tuma, but in a tuma kala, a relatively lower tuma, that's what the Torah allowed. And therefore, even though in this case we have tumas basar, and the Torah is going to allow us to bring the Pesach in a tumas basar situation, we're not going to allow for tumas haguf. So those tmeim will not be able to participate in the carbon Pesach because tuma bechuya b'tzibu. Now we're up to Rav. The Rav Amar, even if the Sakin contracted Tumah from a Sheretz and only the Basar became Tameh, the Shochet himself as a Gava did not become Tameh. Afilu Tmeim Nami Avdei. We're going to invite the Tmeim to participate in this carbon Pesach once we've overridden Tumah. In the case of Tumah's Basar, then we could go all the way. We could allow and invite even the Tmeim to participate in the carbon. And now Rava is going to derive this from a pasuk. However, before we see Rava's drush from the pasuk, let's just comment here that it seems, according to Rashi and at least one opinion in Tosfos, that the reasoning here of Rav Chizda and Rava, respectively, is that Rav Chizda on the one hand holds that we're not going to allow the Tmeim to participate in this Pesach because Tuma Dechuya B'tzibur, and Rava holds Tuma Hutra B'tzibur. And there's no reason why we should hesitate to invite the Tmeim to participate in this carbon. The only problem is, and that's why Tosfos, as I indicated before, vacillates about how to interpret this Rava, is because of a sugya Masechet Zvachim Daf Lamed Gimel. And Rava in that sugya says that Tumah D'chuya B'tzibur. And it must be that somehow in Korban Pesach, we, or I don't know if it's in Korban Pesach, or we'll see if it goes beyond Korban Pesach, but somehow the Gemara is going to have to come up with an alternative to explain why Rava here allows even the Tmeim to participate in the Pesach, and cannot fall back on what seems to be mitbakesh me'eleh, what seems to be the natural answer to this question, that Rava is based on Tuma Utra B'tzibur. But the problem is that Rava holds in Masechet Zvachim Lamed Gimel at Tuma D'chuya B'tzibur, and that's why the Gemara is asking my time. Now, if we assume that Rava holds Tuma D'chuya B'tzibur, we're going to have to conclude that Tuma D'chuya B'tzibur is a D'Rabbanan, and that has to do with Gzeros. On a Doraisa level, Rava is going to derive from Sukkim that once we're bringing the carbon B'tumah, there is no Tumah. My timer, Tichsiv, and now we're in Vayikra Perek Zayin, in the parsha of what's called Tumas B'sar Kodshim, V'abasa shayiga b'chol tamei lo ye'achel ba'esh yisoref, v'abasar kol tar yochal basar. There's a hekesh here between the Reisha of the pasuk and the Seif of the pasuk. The Reisha of the pasuk tells us that if the basar contracts tumah, it cannot be eaten. But the Sefer tells us that kol tar yochal basar, and the pasuk at the end here, kol tar, is referring not to tumas ha-basar, but rather to tumas haguf. There is, according to Rava, an equation here that's inherent in this pasuk between tumas basar and tumas haguf. And it's going to go in two directions. Number one, kol heicha de lo karinan be v'abasa sheyiga b'chol tamei lo yochel is lo karinan be v'abasa kol tar yochel basa. If we would not be able to fulfill the reisha of the pasuk to be mekayim basa kodshim as it is at the beginning of the pasuk, that you're allowed to eat basar kodshim b'tumas ha-basar. For example, in the case where the basar was nitma, it became tamei, like the Pesach, and we're going to be docha the tumah b'tzibur for the sake of the carbon tzibur b'tumas basar. Is Rav interprets that the pasuk is now teaching me ha-basar kol tar yochal basar. In other words, even someone who is tamei b'tumas haguf is allowed to eat the basar. And why is that? Because since we were matir the tumas basar, if the basar contracted tumah, and we activate the principle of the chias tumah for the sake of the carbon pesach b'tzibur, once we do so, and we would dochet tumas basar, then we go the step further, and we're going to be dochet tumas haguf as well. And even tumas haguf is allowed to eat. So that's the equation here between tumas basar and tumas haguf. Now he goes the other way around. V'chol heicha de karinan be v'abasar shayiga b'chol tamei lo ye'achel. When you're not allowed to eat the tumah, the basa betuma. Is Karina Bay, then we apply the pasuk basa kol tar yochal basa. And we need taras haguf. So we only need taras haguf when we're not allowed to eat the basa because of the Easter, when the basa contracts to. But if there's no Easter as a result of the tumas basar, then there's no Easter for the tumas haguf. So this is the hekesh here of Rava equating tumas haguf and tumas basar, because the pasuk says both of them in one breath. So again, the first part of the pasuk is telling me that if and when the the basar contracts tuma, is lo yeach, and that means that there's nothing to be docha the tumas basar. So who's going to eat the basar? A tar is going to eat the basar. What does that mean? A tar is going to eat the basar? It's only in a case where the basar is tar. But if it's not habasa sheyiga b'chol tamei lo yeachel, because we're going to be docha the tumas lo yeachel of tumas habasar, then we don't require habasar kol tar. In other words, the hekesh really, in essence, is telling you just the opposite of what it says in the pasuk in both cases. You have A plus B. So A means we don't eat the basar betuma, and it should be eaten by a tar. But the flip side is that if it's permissible to eat the basar betuma, then it's permissible for a tame, the opposite of a tar, right, to eat from the carbon test. So that's the shita of Rav. Okay. Now, Rabbosa, we get to a sugya. I read this over a dozen times. I hope I got it straight. With your help, you'll have to help me out over and over and over again. Basically, what the Gemara is now going to do, it's going to analyze so many different scenarios and figure out whether or not it's a case where we could be doche tuma because the tzibra tmeim. We're going to count up the numbers. How many tmeim, how many tahorim do we have? Are the numbers balanced? What happens if there's only one extra tame? So you have 51 tmeim and 50 tahorim. Do we need a majority of 2 tmeim? Then we're going to have another issue. What happens if most of the men are tmeim, but most of the women are tahorim? It's a bit complicated. So we'll try. Itmar. So Gemara now records a machlokas between Rav and Rav Kahana. I'm not sure if they were contemporaries. Oh yeah, I think they were. Anyway, what's the case? Mechtal mechtal. It's amazing. 50-50. Again, you're talking about a population, the Gemara says, of 1.2 million people bringing the carbon Pesach. I don't know how feasible it is that it's Haresha Ha Yisrael Mechza Tahorim U Mechza Tmeim. Punkt. Exactly. I don't know. But the halach has to deal with every theoretical construct. Rav Amar Mechza Mechza Kirov. And we'll see exactly what that means in a minute. But basically, Kirov here can go 2 directions. You can consider the Rov Tahorim, and if it's Tar, or you consider the Rov Tmeim. Or maybe we can consider both, Rov in both directions. Rav Kahana Omar Mechza Mechza Eno Kirov, which means that there's no Rov Tahorim and there's no Rov Tmeim. Okay. Now the Gemara works this out. There are going to be two Lashonos in Rav Kahana, but the fundamental machlokus remains the same, even in the Lishna Bas. Rav Amar Mechzal Mechzal Kirov. What does this mean? Every single mechza is treated like it's a rov. Halalu osim liatzmam, valalu osim liatzmam. Now, what is that? Now, let's start with the second halalu, because that's the easier one for me, if you don't mind. The second halalu is a reference to the Tmeim. And Rav considers mechza kirov. If mechza is kirov, then you have here rov Tmeim. If you have a rov Tmeim, then this is a carbon abba b'tumah. Because tumah d'chuya b'tzibur. We can be docha the isa tumah and bring the carbon pesach. We don't have to tell them skedoodle and come back in a month. And that's because they are considered like rov. But on the other hand, now let's go back to the first half of Rav's statement. The mechza tahorim are also considered rov, which means that the Pesach could not be brought bituma. It has to be brought bitara. So how do we reconcile these two? So Rav says we're going to split Klal Yisrael into two different kihilot. By the way, that's not bad too. It gets really complicated when there's more than two, unfortunately. Anyway, so Rav says the following, that the mechza tahorim are considered like rov tahorim, which is a gevaldige chumrah, because it means that the mechza tahorim, will have to bring the carbon tara, and there won't be any leniencies whatsoever. The kohanim will have to be tahorim, and the klei sharis will have to be tahorim, and it goes without saying that the bailim that are menuyim on the Pesach, who are the ochlim in the Pesach, they're all tahorim. It's a classic case of a carbon Pesach. They cannot take advantage of the fact that there's rov tmein. Why? Because there's also rov tahorim. That's the paradox. And we have to treat this case as rov tahorim and rov tmein. So the good news for the tmeim is that they can bring the carbon Pesach. Why? Because we have a case of rov tmein. But we're not going to go the step further and say that one carbon Pesach is enough. When I say one, I don't mean one lamb. I say, but one hakrava of X number of lambs, that's not going to be enough. We're going to have to institute another series or round of hakravos bitara, because we also have rov tahor. And that's called in the language of Rav, halolu osim liatzma, halolu osim liatzma. Now I have a note here. He says that as far as the second osim liatzma, meaning the tmeim, ochlim esav pesach betuma. So the tahorim are going to bring their karbanos. They can't eat it betuma if they later on they contract tuma. So imagine if after the akrav on erev Pesach, sometime before nightfall, Ploni Almoni contracted tuma, he's not going to be able to eat the carbon betuma, because the halacha of Pesach haba betuma doesn't apply here, because you have rov tahorim. However, as far as the Tmeim are concerned, they actually have a Pesach haba betuma. With the whole kit and caboodle, they'll eat the Pesach betuma. The afshat Tmeim chashuvim karov le'inyan she'enam nidach Pesach sheni. Aval enam chashuvim karov le'inyan sheyuchlu hatahorim lasos imayim betuma. So you might ask the question we mentioned before the Tosfos read, aren't you insulting the Tmeim because you're telling the Torim, stay away? I mean, the Torim are telling the Tmeim, stay away. I guess that's not an insult because we're really setting up two different Korban Pesach. Let's mention, you remember Rabbi Nosson we had a few days ago. At one Pesach is enough for all of Klal Yisrael. So here we're going to have, let's say, two Karbanos Pesach for the entire Klal Yisrael. So one is Betara and one is Betuma. And there's no overlap, so that the Tmeim are not insulted because they have their Karban, Betuma, and the Torim say, well, we're going to bring our Karban, we have to bring our Karban Betara. Now, the Meiri is bothered by the following. We have a principle called Ein Karban Tzibur Cholok. You remember that Mishnah? The language of the Mishnah. And that means that once we bring the Karban B'tumah, we do it exactly the way we would do it if it was B'tara. Nobody has to avoid participating in the Karban. He says, Ein Omrim Kein El B'ofen Shat Tahorim Heim Miut Vat Meim Heim Arov. In a classic case where the Karban Pesach is brought B'tumah because the Tmeim are the Rov, then the Miut are bottled to the Rov. And everybody does it B'tumah. And again, as I said before, the Kohanim could be Tmeim, and the Klisharis could be Tmeim, and the Ochlei Abasa could be Tmeim, and if the Torah contracted Tumah, he could still eat it. That's because the Miut is bottled to the Rov, and the Rov are Tmeim. Aval b'mechzal mechza, in our case, Shavineh. You can't use Bittel here. The Einkan Miut, she is Batel B'Rov. You can't say that the Miut Tahorim are bottled to the Rov Tmeim, and therefore the Tahorim are, have no status here, and the Pesach could be, as we said before, brought B'tumah. No, the Tahorim are not bottled; they form their own entity and their own Korban Pesach. Then he asks the following question. He says, "Kasha, heichanu machshivim sheyesh kan Rov Tmeim begam Rov Tmeim, Rov Tahorim begam Rov Tmeim. Hello, Zelo Yitachet. Ki im arov hem tahorim hatmeim hem miut. The im hatmeim hem arov has hatmeim hatorim hem miut. That was the paradox that we mentioned before. He said, "B'dover echad lo shaykh shnei ruba." You can't have two rows in two different directions on the same counting. So that's what we wanted to suggest. He doesn't give an answer to this question, but we wanted to suggest that according to Rav, the concept of rov here means the absence of a fakerta rov, of a different rov that contradicts this. So since you don't have rov tmeim, therefore we go back to the halacha of rov tahorim. But on the other hand, you cannot be mavakel the tmeim, and therefore the Korban is hutar or chuya, right, for the sake of the tmeim. Rav Kahana disagrees. Mechza ain't a rov. Nobody has a rov here. Neither the Tahorim nor the Tmeim. Tahorim osim is harishon. Rashi has a whole piece here on this. And what it means is that Rav Kahana can't disagree that the Tahorim can bring the Korban B'tara, because in any case, you could always bring the Korban B'tara. We don't lose anything. And even if there's no rov, we don't need rov tahorim to bring the Korban B'tara. You bring any Korban B'tara. Rashi has a whole piece on this. But Tmeim Osimus Hasheni, we push off the Tmeim because Eino Karov. In other words, Rav had allowed the Mechza Tmeim to be considered upgraded to the state of Rov, meaning because there was no Rov Tahorim, therefore the Tmeim have a right to demand that we could bring the Korban B'tumah. Rav Kahana says no. This halach of Rov Tmeim, the Torah allowed for a Korban B'tumah, it's Korban Pesach B'tumah because you have Rov Tmeim, but here you don't have Rov Tmeim. It's almost as if Rav understood that halach of being dochet tumah for the sake of rov means that if you have Rov Tahorim, we're not going to allow the Tmeim to bring that Korban Pesach. But if you don't have Rov Tahorim, in the absence of Rov Tahorim, you can't be Mavata, you can't completely disqualify the Tmeim, you have Mechza Tmeim, let them be considered like a Rov. And we're going to be Dochet to them with the Korban Spot. But Rav Kana says, no, there's a halach of Rov Tzibur Tmeim, and I counted the numbers, there's no Rov Tzibur Tmeim. Now, the one point in Rav Kahana's presentation that's unclear is the issue of Pesach Sheni. Rav Kahana says that you don't have Rov Tmeim, and therefore you cannot bring the Korban B'tumah. It makes sense intuitively, the first Halishana, the one we're learning now, that Rav Kahana would say the Tmeim can't be part of the Pesach. They don't have a Rov. Let them bring a Pesach Sheni. But it's not so clear. Why? Because this is a year in which we're going to bring the Korban Pesach. So how do we view the Mechza Tmeim? One way is to say it, that since you're not a Rov, you're gone. You're out of the picture. You have no shaychus to this Korban Pesach because we cannot bring the Korban Pesach B'tumah. So Mechza is like individual members of the Kal. If any individual member of the Kal becomes Tamei, so the Torah says, let him bring a Pesach Sheni. But in that case, we are clearly telling the Tmeim that they are individuals. They don't form a Kal. Now, there's another way of learning this din of Mechza. Although Rav Kahana is not willing to allow the Tmeim to bring a Korban Pesach, but on the other hand, since they're Mechza, they also are part of the Korban Pesach. Again, they can't involve themselves actively in bringing the Korban Pesach. We don't have Rov. That's Rav Kahana's logic. But you can't exclude them from the Korban Pesach because they form a kahal that equals half of the populace. Ikar diamri omer Rav Kahana mechzal mechzeinik Rov to orim osim es harishon. Here we turn to on base. Utmeim einam osim los harishon v'los hashen. The Tmeim don't have to bring a Korban Pesach Sheni in this case because they're Mechza. And the Gemara explains, but Rishon lo avdi delavi ruba. That we understood. Rav Kahana's argument is that in order to bring a Korban B'tumah, you need Rov Tmeim, and we don't have Rov Tmeim. But what about B'sheni lo avdi? And the answer is the law of Miyuta. When there are individual members of the community of Israel, Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi are Tmeim, send them to Pesach Sheni. But you cannot consider Mechza Kol as individuals. And he says the following in the footnote, that when the Torah specifies Pesach Sheni, it says Ish, an individual gets pushed off the Pesach Sheni because he's Tameh. The Ein Tzibur Nidachim. Hakavana, the Yesh Miut, who connect to our Rov. Why does the Miut, Tmeim, get pushed off to Pesach Sheni? Because the Rov Tahorim are looking them in the face and saying, look, we have rights to bring the Korban Pesach. And that's a Pesach B'tara. You're already in the category of an Ish. Why? Because we have a Rov against you. He says, but ba'ofen shel mechza al mechza shem shavim, you cannot say that the Tmeim are considered Ish. Again, they don't form a tzibur because Rav Kahana's point is that mechza is not kirov, so we don't have a tzibur that we could say that this is a Korban Pesach b'tumah b'tzibur. But on the other hand, you cannot consider them Ish. the Torah says that an ish is pushed off to Pesach Sheni if he's tummy. You cannot say about this group that they're an ish. Why? Because when there's a rov tahorim, the rov overrides the miyut, and each member of that miyut class is nothing more than a yachid. He's an ish. But when you don't have a rov of tahorim, then what undermines the status of the tmeim as a tzibur? They are no less of a tzibur than the tahorim are concerned. So basically, we have no tzibur. And therefore, Einam Osim Pesach Klal. Now, I'm not sure what's going on here. Is it that they fall between the cracks, according to Rav Kahana's second Mishnah? Meaning, Mimonashaf. Either you're chayav in Pesach Rishon, B'Toras Sibur, and you cannot be according to Rav Kahana. Or you're chayav in Pesach Sheni as Yechidim, but you're not Yechidim either because there's no Rov Tahorim. There's no way that we can impose a chiyuv of Korban Pesach Sheni because they don't fit any of the two categories. They fall between the cracks. We have one category called Rov Tmeim. They don't fit that category. On the other hand, you cannot call them ish and individuals because there's no Rov Tahorim that would downgrade the status of the Tmeim into Yechidim. Well, what gives you the right as Tahorim? We have the same power that you do. And therefore then, but honestly, I'm not comfortable with that. I would rather say that the Karban is now for both Tziburs. And although Rav Kahana insists that the Tmeim cannot participate, that's because we don't have the power to be docha the tumah and let them actively participate in akrava, but they are part of Klal Yisrael. They're no less of a tzibur. But that's not what he's saying over here. And he tells you to look in the Chazon Ish. Now he quotes another possibility. This is where I got stuck on Shabbos. Maybe this could help me personally to understand this sugya, because with the Chazon Ish, I'm just not comfortable. Maybe, I don't know. We give it a try. He says, Kavadas Hadrasha, Ish Yachid Nidche. Aval im hatmeim einam b'chlal ish, she'enam yechidim, einam nidchim, v'osim b'rishon b'tumaf she'enam b'chlal tzibur. L'fi zeh, I know he seems to be repeating the same shtickle Torah. Einam nidchim, v'osim b'rishon b'tumaf, she'enam b'chlal tzibur. לפי זה, באופן של מחצל מחצב, שאינם רוב, ואינם מיעוט, מכל מקום צריך להיות הדין, שהטמאים יעשו בראשון, כיוון שאינם בכלל יחידים. ומדוע אומר רב כהנא, שהטמאים אינם עושים כלל? Abiri says, שאף שמחצה, דינם כרוב, Lasos betuma, mikom kom enatmeim osim betuma, lefishi torim osim betara. Vim atmeim yasu betuma, yitztarchu kulav lasos betuma, v'neshe ein korban tzibur cholok. Ula me'acher she'en atmeim rov mamish, eno roi shatahorim yasu betum beglolam, l'chein ein atmeim osim klal. Can't figure it out. Something, it's either it's in me or it's in the pedagogy here. I don't know. It's not clear. Again, I'm just going to read it one more time and then we'll go on. I don't want to belabor the point because I don't know if you have the text in front of you. It's the second half of the first footnote on the page. If anybody has the text, just raise your hand so I know. So I'm reading in Torah Shval Peh for you. The good old days, Yechiel, you remember, used to print this out. He had a way of printing this out. Magical. Anyway, I'll just read it one more time. Maybe by chance it'll sink in. He says the following. Right, the Gemara says, this is back on Samach Vavam and Beis, that each nidchevi ain't tzibur nidach. That was the drasha from the word ish, to teach me that if rov tzibur atmeim, we override tuma for the sake of the Korban Pesach, and we bring it betum. Kavanas hadrasha, ish yachid nidcha. Aval im hatmeim eno b'chal isha enam yechidim enom nidachin. The osim berishon betuma. Af she'enom b'chlal tzibur. So he seems to be saying that unless you get ish, there's no pushing you off to Pesach Sheni. As long as the Tmeim are not called ish, which means they're not yechidim, that's enough to bring the Korban Pesach B'tumah. Okay, fine. That makes sense according to Rav, but we're going now according to Rav Kahana. Lefizeh, the ofek shel mechza al mechza, af she'eno rov, the eno miut, mikol makom tzarich lios hadin shatmeim yasu berichon. Why? Because we said that who gets pushed off to Pesach Sheni is only the Yachid. Here, in the case of Mechza Mechza, again, they're not Rov, but on the other hand, they're not a Miut, and therefore they have no less rights to bring the Korban Pesach. They're not bumped off by the word Ish, which refers to Yechid. Now, I think we more or less said this. Madua Omer of Kahana, Shatmeim Einam Osim Klal. That's the second Mishnah. And then he gives the following explanation. He says, this is the whole business where if we were to bring the Korban Tumah, then the Taharim would also be participating in a Korban Tumah. He says, Af shemechta dinam kirov lasos betumah. In other words, we shouldn't push them off in a case of mechza because they're not yechidim, and the Torah pushes off a yachid, ish. But mikolakom, einat meim osim betumah. This is Rav Kahana, that we cannot allow for the Tmeim to bring the Korban Tumah. Why? Lefisha tahorim ha'osim b'tara, osim b'tara, v'yim ha'tmeim yasu b'tumah, yitztachu kulam lasos b'tumah, ne'she'en Korban tzibur chaluk. So Rav, we said before, he's not bothered by ein Korban tzibur chaluk. Only in the case of Rov Tmeim, but here we don't have Rov Tmeim. But Rav Kahana, even in the case of a Mechza, he's bothered by this principle of Ein Korban Tzibur Chaluk. We can't split the Tzibur into two. Ula me'achar she'ein atmeim Rov Mamish, Ein Roy Shatahorim Yasu B'tumah B'glola. So we're between a rock and a hard place. Why? Because on the one hand, since they're not Yechidim, then the Mechza Tmeim should be able to bring the Pesach. On the other hand, according to Rav Kahana, once you allow the Tmeim who are Mechza to bring the Korban B'tumah, then we activate the principle of Einat Tzibur Chaluk, and now the Tahorim should have to bring the Korban B'tumah together with the Tmeim. There's going to be one Korban for all of Klal Yisrael. And that's Eino Roy. Why is it Eino Roy that the Tahorim should be part of this? Because the Tmeim don't have a rove. When the Tmeim have a rove, they have a right to, how should I say, suck in the Tahorim, invite the Tahorim. You join us because ain't that Tzibur Challah. But in a case where the Tmeim they don't amount to a rove, they don't have the power to invite the Tahorim. And then we get to here's where I lose it, at the punchline. Lachein ein atmeim osim klal. So in other words, what we're saying now is that when Rav Kahana says metzal metzedek a rove, he means they're not like a rove to allow the Tahorim to bring the carbon betumah because of them, because of pressing on the button of Ein Tzibur Chol. I don't know. I'm tempted, if I only had more proof, to assume that he's on my side here against the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish is saying that they don't fit into any category, these Tmeim, the Mechza Tmeim, and therefore they're neither in Pesach Rishon nor in Pesach Sheni. I would go a step further. I would say that since Rav Kahana is bothered by the principle of Einat Tzibur Cholok, in working this out, he comes to the conclusion that they can't be part of the Korban Pesach before the Pesach Rishon. But there's no reason or justification to push them off to Pesach. Again, Rabbi say, believe it or not, this is the easy part of the Sukkah. Now we learned to that Mishnah, Nitma kol arubo shayu konim tmeim, vakol tahorim yaseh bituma. This is a clear-cut proof to Rav Kahana. Why? Because the Mishnah says that the reason why we bring the Korban Pesach bituma is because we have orubo. Rubo hu di avdi betuma, aval palgo lo avdi berishon v'kasha l'Rav. Right? Rav holds that even if you have palgo betuma, we will bring the korban betuma at least for the tmeim. And the Mishnah says that in order to be yaseh betuma, you need a rove. It's not enough to have mechza. According to Rav, we should rewrite the Mishnah, and the Mishnah should be saying mechza is enough to bring the korban betuma, because Rav holds we're going to bring the korban betuma on behalf, for the sake of the tmeim, even though they're not rov, they're only mechza. Rav ruba. When the Mishnah says that you need a rov, that's avdi kulu betuma. You want to bring the korban on behalf of the entire kal of Klal Yisrael betuma. For that you need rov tmeim. Palgo, halolo osim liatzman, halolo osim liatzman. And hochinami mistabra, that's really the way we should read that Mishnah, because the Ketani Sefer, when you look in the Sefer of the Mishnah, it says nitma miut hakol, tahorim osim es harishon, utmeim osim es hasheni. And the Mishnah is very careful. It says that if only miut of the kol were tmeim, then we push off the tmeim. Miut hu diavdi b'sheni. When do we push off the tmeim? That's because they were miut. Aval palga lo. We're not going to push off the tmeim. Let them bring their own korban rishon bituma. The avdi b'rishon alolo osam liatzman alolo osam liatzman. Hela says the Gemara kasha l'Rav Kahana. Now that you've quoted the Sefer seems to be clear proof in favor of Rav. What's Rav Kahana going to do with the Sefer? Rav Kahana says, don't be medayik from the Sefer, the Metzal Mechza, the Tmeim could bring the korban, but rather read it like this: Nitmu miut hakol, tahorim osim es harishon, Tmeim osim es hasheni. And the implication is that only in a case where nitmu miut, then we push off the Tmeim to Pesach Sheni. Palga Tahorim osim es harishon, aval tmeim ein osim lo es harishon velo es hashen. Okay, then, so let's make a note